and welcome back. My name's Diana. This is my channel Bookish Di, and today I'm wrapping up my June in reading. So June overall was a pretty solid month. I ended up reading 12 books, and there were a few that were more misses. Like, they're not terrible, but they're not my favorites. But overall, it was another pretty solid month. I feel like I'm in my nonfiction era right now. Like, nonfiction wasn't the majority of what I read, but it was a third. And there were a few nonfiction books that I actually started in June and ended up finishing in July. So I'll be talking about them in next month's wrap up. But yeah, I've been in a nonfiction mood lately. And overall, it's been working for me. I've read some really interesting nonfiction books this year. The first book that I read in June was Period, The Real Story of Menstruation, written and narrated by Kate Clancy. This is more of an academic nonfiction book, and it's exactly what it says on the tin. It's a history of menstruation. It talks about kind of the process of menstruation. It talks about things that affect menstruation and cultural practices around menstruation, and the fact that there's really no such thing as a normal period, that periods as a whole are incredibly varied, and any attempt to standardize them can have really negative impacts on those who don't fit that norm. So I heard about this book because it was featured on a bonus episode of This Podcast Will Kill You, which is an epidemiology podcast. I know I've mentioned it before. I really recommend it. And their bonus episodes this season are essentially book clubs where one of the errands, I can never remember which one it is. So apologies, errands from This Podcast Will Kill You. But one of the errands interviews authors that have books that touch on different topics. And so menstruation has been something that the errands have talked about before in terms of how like different diseases or vaccines might affect people with periods. And they interviewed Kate Clancy to talk about this book. And it was the interview itself is very interesting. I really recommend it. And overall, I liked this book. It does get very technical sometimes, which in an audiobook made it a little difficult, which did detract from my enjoyment for a bit. But overall, I thought it was incredibly informative, and it did a really good job of not just focusing on the science of menstruation and talking about the impacts of pregnancy, the impacts of disease or stress or environmental factors on menstruation and how that might lead to some different health outcomes. So for example, one of the things Clancy talks about is higher maternal mortality for Black folks who are pregnant. She also talks about menstruation starting earlier and earlier, reasons why menstruation might be delayed in teenagers, specifically talking about like over-exercise and eating disorders. So yeah, I thought this was a really great book. If you're looking for something sciencey and you're at all interested in the topic, I would really recommend it. I learned a lot. It was definitely interesting and made me think. I'll also say that for people who might be worried, this book does not get bogged down in gender essentialist bullshit. They do a very good job of framing it as people who menstruate and talking about the fact that not everyone who menstruates is a woman. Some folks might be transmass, some folks might be non-binary, and that not all people who are women necessarily menstruate. So I really appreciated that component of this book. So I gave it about 4.25. Like I said, it does get a little technical, so I don't know if I'd recommend the audiobook, but overall I enjoyed it. It was a really solid nonfiction book. The second book that I read was The Family That Couldn't Sleep by D.T. Max. This is another science nonfiction book, and it also, me reading it was triggered by a podcast. In particular, the 2 episodes that Maintenance Phase did on mad cow disease. So mad cow disease is a prion disease, or prion. I think it depends on like if you're British or if you're American, like which pronunciation it is. And so prions are essentially misfolded proteins that can cause a range of diseases, mostly neurological. And so this book, which it is an older book, this book was released in 2006, goes into the history of prion diseases up to that point. And so part of what the author was interested in is he's disabled. He has a a muscular degenerative disease, I believe. And so he was interested in seeing like how prion disease might relate to what he has. And it was a really fascinating read. So the through line throughout this book is a family in Venice, Italy, who have this inherited prion disease, which leads, like in their 50s or 60s, leads to fatal insomnia. So they can't sleep and it eventually wears their body out. But he also talks about the history of prion disease in the world, talks about scabies, chronic wasting disease. He also talks about how, and I'm completely blanking on this asshole's name, but how one of the foremost researchers for prion disease was a pedophile, and kind of shines a light on some of the darker underpinnings of science, and how people in charge were willing to ignore the fact, like it was pretty well known, were willing to ignore it because he did good science. So it was really interesting on that front as well. If anyone has read, it's the first book by the author who wrote A Little Life. It's loosely based on this guy. So anyway, I really liked it. I do wish there was an updated version, or like an updated popular science book about prion disease, because I don't know like what's changed in the 17 years since this book was released, but overall it was interesting. I gave it a 3.75 stars. I would definitely recommend it if you're interested in learning about it. I will say, however, that it is like prion diseases are kind of terrifying, and yeah, just know that going in. It is very creepy. This Podcast Will Kill You also did an episode on prion disease, which I also recommend listening to. It's one of their earlier episodes, and to the point where like I completely forgot that they did it. We were talking about this episode in Moneyness's Discord, and I'm like, oh, I wish This Podcast Will Kill You did that. And someone's like, Diana, they did. I'm like, I forgot about that. So yeah. Anyway, again, another plug for This Podcast Will Kill You. So yeah, overall, really interesting book, really enjoyed it. I just wish there was an updated version. The third book I read was another nonfiction book. See what I mean about being in my nonfiction era? And that was Hey Hun, Sales, Sisterhood, Supremacy, and Other Lies Behind Multi-Level Marketing, written and narrated by Emily Lynn Paulson. So I picked this book up because my friend Renee had mentioned it was a book that she was looking forward to in a recent episode we did, a Fangirl Happy Hour. And I was like, I'm always interested in scams and cons and stuff. So I put a request in at the library and they bought it. And this was not the book I was expecting. So Emily Lynn Paulson was involved in an MLM, and she got to an incredibly high position, to the point she was one of their top earners. She was making a ton of money off of it. She got a car, and I thought this book would be more of like a sociological perspective, or like looking more at kind of the factors behind MLMs, talking pretty in depth about how MLMs can tie into white supremacy and religion and patriarchy. And we do get some of that, but this book is more of a memoir. This book is more of Paulson talking about her experiences and how she got involved and how it impacted her life and her relations with others. And I think had I known that going in, I might not have picked up the book, because while I do think that having a personal lens is important, like I listened, Roberta Blevins, who was one of the people interviewed on the Lula Rich documentary series, has a podcast where she talks about other MLMs and interviews other survivors, or like other people who were involved and got out. A lot of the people that she talks to weren't super high up, and this is someone who was profiting quite heavily off of it. And this read to me a lot of her trying to justify herself, and like a little bit of accountability, but also being like, yeah, I didn't want to leave because the money was so good, and I felt trapped. And I don't necessarily know if this book went into enough of her making amends for me, if that makes sense. So yeah, I I didn't really enjoy this book. I think I would give it like a 2.75. Like, it's not terrible. It's not like a awful book, but like I said, one, it wasn't the book that I was expecting, and two, I'm not super interested in someone who was that high up on an MLM. And then the other parts, she didn't go in depth enough for me. So yeah, this was probably my least favorite book of June. Then I read a book that I really liked, and that was Arusha and the Tree of Wishes by Roshni Chokshi, narrated by Sunila Nankani. This is the third book in the Arusha Quintet, which is part of the Rick Riordan Presents line. And this book has been on my series TBR, and I am slowly making my way through it, and I really liked this. So this book picks up about a year after Arusha and the Song of Death. And the book starts with Aru, Minnie, Bryn, and Aiden on a rescue mission to find a seer who's been kidnapped because it's said that she has a prophecy that will relate to their fight with the sleeper, and whoever listens to it will have an edge in the final battle. And it turns out that the seer is a twin, and both twins are the final Pandavas, and it is Nikita and Sheila. And the demons hear the prophecy, and so the Pandavas are sidelined to try and touch up their image and restore confidence. And they think that the sleeper, Aru's father, is going after the Tree of Wishes, and they need to go find the Tree of Wishes because the one that's on public display is a fake. And so Bryn, Aiden, Minnie, and Aru go on a quest, and they have to find the tree and figure out what's going on with the sleeper. And during this, Aru is also dealing with dealing with the fact that adults keep letting her down, adults keep lying to her, they keep not living up to the standards that she has for them. And she's questioning whether or not the Pandavas will do more harm than good by fighting the demons and the Asuras. And yeah, I really like this. I think this is a book where Roshni Chokshi definitely leveled up in this series. Like, yes, you do have that fun quest aspect to it, but a lot of what's going on in this book is much more internal, and you have more of Aru trying to come to her own conclusions about what's happening. She's trying to deal with the fact that, adults sometimes let you down, and sometimes aren't the people who you thought they were. And I thought that it was handled really well in this book. I continue to really enjoy the different characters as well. Minnie gets her time to shine in this, and it is delightful. We get more figures from Hindu mythology, and we learn more about the battle that's being set up throughout the series. And yeah, I really enjoyed this. I gave this a 4.25 out of 5, and I'm hoping to get to book 4 later this month and continue making my way through this series. The next 3 books I read are part of a series, so I'm going to talk about them all together, and that is the Kingston Cycle by C.L. Polk. So Witchmark, Storm Song, which the audiobook is narrated by Moira Quirk, and then Soulstar, the audiobook narrated by Robin Miles. And so each book follows a different protagonist. It's all linked together. Also, this is the bi flag, which I love. And it is set in this kind of Edwardian England inspired place called Aylin. And when the series starts, Aylin has just finished a war of conquest, and soldiers are coming home, and Miles, who is the son of a noble who ran away to join the army to be a doctor, is treating veterans who have battle fatigue, and he notices there's something wrong with them, that they have this kind of cloud within them, because Miles is a magician, and part of the reason he ran away is the magic that he has, healing, isn't valued by the noble families because they only value people who can storm sing, people who can control the weather, and anyone who isn't that becomes a secondary, and they're basically living batteries for family members to draw on. And Miles didn't want that, so he ran away. And that's where this book picks off, and he meets this fae, or this fae-like creature, Tristan, who their species is called amaranthines, and they oversee the dead. And Tristan comes in with this man who's saying he's been killed, and it leads to Tristan and Miles uncovering what is actually happening in Aeland, why the war was being fought, and what's going on with common witches who are basically kidnapped and put in asylums. Book 2 follows his sister Grace, and this was a little bit of a harder sell on me because Grace does something pretty heinous in this book, and it was really interesting to see how Grace atones for her actions in Witchmark and how she grows and kind of starts turning from collaborator to ally to accomplice. And then Soulstar is the final book, and it follows Robin, who we met in Witchmark, who is Miles, who's a nurse who's trained to become a surgeon, and it turns out she's also a community organizer, fighting to get the law that allows for witches to be interned in asylums repealed. And it's after that repeal where she and her community are trying to integrate the former folks who've been in asylums back. It's dealing with revolution and what political change is, and incrementalism versus rapid change. And I adored this series. I do think it's a series where the sum is greater than the parts. Like, I would say this is like a 4.5 or 4.25, 4.25, 4.5, and the overall series for me was a 5-star. I loved C.L. Polk's writing. I loved how they were focusing on the political and what does change look like and how do we achieve change and what might people need to do to kind of force change to happen. I also really liked how she wrote the different characters and how distinct they felt. Like, Miles is very different from Grace, who is very different from Robin. And yeah, I thought the world building was fantastic. I thought the story that Polk was writing in this and the commentary that they had was also really great. I will say this is a really good example as well of fantasy with a romantic element versus a fantasy romance. And so for me, I would compare it to, if a comparison I would have is A Marvelous Light. Like, there is a romantic element to this, but especially in Witchmark, it's kind of the weaker part for me because it's a little insta-lovey. And Polk does get better and better at writing the romances throughout the series, but the romances are never the focus. The focus is always the political action. What's going on with the characters? What are they hoping to achieve? And how are they trying to push Aeland to a better future, a more equitable future? Whereas something like A Marvelous Light, the romance is the central component. And so I think for me, like, that's a good distinction between romantic fantasy versus fantasy romance. Anyway, I really love this series. I'm so glad I finally got around to finishing it. I am now a little sad that it didn't win Hugo for Best Series last year because I think it's so good and it should have been recognized. But yeah, I loved it so much. Overall, 5 stars for the series, and I would really recommend picking it up. So before I get started with the next book that I read, so 4th nonfiction book for this month, we have a visitor. Anyway, the 4th nonfiction book that I read in June was Burn It Down, Power, Complicity, and a Call for Change in Hollywood by Maureen Ryan. So Maureen Ryan is a journalist. She's a contributing editor to Vanity Fair, and she's one of the people who has been documenting abuses of power within Hollywood and working towards accountability and a better future. And so this book is split into 2 parts. The first is dismantling common myths of Hollywood that lead to these sorts of abuses of power. So about the price of genius, about race, about gender. And then the second part is how to build a better Hollywood. So she gets into the issue of repentance and reparations. She talks to Rabbi Danya, who wrote a book, Repentance and Repair. She provides models for different types of writing and creative situations and talks to people who are trying to break the cycle of abuse and do things differently in Hollywood, and kind of looks forward into what work has happened and what work that still needs to happen. So overall, I did like this book. I think Ryan is a fantastic writer. There's so much in here that is absolutely infuriating. Like, there have been some chapters that have been released and adapted. So the Lost chapter, there's some stuff about SNL and the one that made me the angriest, which is about the show Sleepy Hollow, and how Nicole Berry was really marginalized and let down by the production, and how that impacted her career, and how her career is only just recovering from that. And just that one made me so angry because I loved the first season of Sleepy Hollow, and that show just went downhill so fast in season 2, and just hearing what was going on behind the scenes was absolutely infuriating. I found that the second half, while necessary, also did drag a bit. So like I said, the second half is kind of talking about how do we fix this? What are some things that people can do to make things better in the future? And like I said, I do think it was necessary. I found it less focused than the first half, and it was more kind of not as tightly written. And I do think that makes sense because this is something where it's much easier to talk about what's wrong than to talk about how do we make it better. But I found the book, for me, lost a bit of momentum. It's not to say it's a bad book, but that's just kind of my impressions on it. Content warnings with this one for sexual abuse, sexual harassment, racism, grooming, misogyny. Just be prepared going in. This is a book where there is just, it's a very clear-eyed look at what's happened and what is continuing to happen in Hollywood. So overall, I gave it a 4.25. I really liked it. I really like Maureen Ryan's writing. I do enjoy the work that she, like her shorter work, so her articles and columns, and I would highly recommend this book as well if you're interested at all in kind of situations that in Hollywood and what's happening to change them. Next is a series of Ilona Andrew books. I'm going to talk about them all individually. So the first is Gunmetal Magic. This is a companion novel to the Kate Daniel series, and we are following Andrea. This is set between books 5 and 6, and we are getting insight into Andrea, what's going on with her, and seeing her transition from former Knight of the Order of Merciful Aid to a member of the pack. And this was a disappointment to me, and I was prepared for it to not hit the same way as the mainline Kate Daniels books have been, because folks in my Nessa's Discord had read it last month and didn't like it, so my expectations were very low going, and it ended up being okay, but it didn't hit the same high that other books in this series have, and there are a few reasons for that. One is I feel like they weren't quite sure how to write Andrea processing her trauma and processing like the events that led to where she is at the start of the series. I also wasn't a fan of how they wrote the breakup between Andrea and Raphael and just how they were adapting to it. And the pacing at the end was just really off. Like, the Andrews do tend to have this very fast ending in terms of the climax and conclusions of their books, but this was just pretty egregious, and it all happened so quickly in a way that wasn't super satisfying for me. So I would say this overall was like a 3-star. There is a novella in here as well, and that is Magic Gifts, and that is what Kate was doing at the start of this book, and that I liked much better. That was more of like a 4-star for me. And just because it felt more like in line with how the series normally is. And I really liked seeing what Kate was doing and why she showed up with a vampire head at the start of this book. And so yeah, it was fine. It didn't hit the same way that the Kate Daniels books usually do, and it was very disappointing. The next Kate Daniels book I read was also kind of a disappointment, but it was one I was prepared for, and that is Magic Raises. And this is the 6th book in the Kate Daniels series. And in this, Kate, Kieran, and other members of the pack are going to Europe because the European packs have this paste cure called Panacea, which helps prevent children from going loop. So children from losing control of being a shifter and having to be killed, because once you go loop, you can't come back from that. When they get there, they find out several things. And the reason they go to Europe is that they've been asked to kind of mediate this territory dispute, and they know it's going to be a trap, and they know it's not, there's something that they haven't seen, there's a catch, but they're being offered a year's worth of panacea, and that's too good of a deal to pass up. And so when they get there, they find out that the person who owns the castle where they're meeting is Hugh d'Ambray, who is Kate's father's right-hand man and someone that she has been trying to avoid for several books. And we also have Kieran acting weird around this other female shapeshifter, and people underestimating Kate, and Kate being like wanting to kill Hugh, which I get it, girl. I also want you to kill Hugh. And this book does end on a bit of a bittersweet note. So what I liked about this book, Kate is great. Kate is amazing. We get a little bit of fairy tale component to it, where like a kind act by our hero has positive consequences later on, which is great. I really loved Cassandra, who is a character we meet in this book. She is a hoot. I really enjoyed her. And I liked seeing kind of the upping of the stakes in this book, as well as seeing our characters be somewhere other than Atlanta. What I didn't like about this book, Kieran makes a very boneheaded decision, and it's terrible and ill thought out, and it leads to Kate feeling very bad. And throughout the book, I'm just like, Kate, bestie, you're so much better than him. You can, like, I know you love him, but also if you want to hide his body, I would help you, because you are 100% justified. And like I've sent throughout the next book, and Kieran is back in my good graces, but it was rough reading this book. I am not gonna lie. So I would say this is like a 3.5, 3.75. Like, it's just so frustrating because I really hated Kieran in this book and the decisions that he was making. Anyway, yeah. Like I said, I've read the next book and it's better. I'm much happier about Kate Daniels right now. And then the last Alona Andrews book or thing that I read in June was Magic Steals. This is the accompanying novella. It takes place in Atlanta while everyone is off in Europe, and it follows Dolly and Jim. And Dolly is asked by her mother to look into the mysterious disappearance of another member of the Indonesian community, and she finds out that there is a curse targeting her as well as targeting other members in the strip mall that her shop is located in. And she and Jim are also working out some of their relationship issues, and Dolly is also working out some of her issues with her mom. And yeah, so it was fine. I think with me, my issues with the Dolly books are the writing is just a little awkward in terms of Dolly's insecurities. I do like getting more of Dolly and her mom, and them and her mom apologizing for some things and kind of explaining her reasoning and realizing that even with that reasoning, it still had a negative impact on her daughter. I thought the magic stuff was interesting and the conclusion, and it was fine. It's like a 3.5 read. Then I listened to The Wicked Bargain, written by Gabe Cole Novoa, narrated by Vico Ortiz. This is a YA fantasy book set in the early 19th century, and it follows Mar, who is our transmask NB protagonist who's raised on a pirate ship, and they find out that their father had made a deal with the devil when they were young to save their life, and they would get 16 years to be pirates, and then the devil comes to collect, and Mar survives, but the devil El Diablo comes back and is like, if you want to save your father's soul, you have to give your soul to me. And Mar gets rescued by another pirate ship where a handsome young man, Bas, is there, Sebastian. And they're also approached by this gender fluid demon called Dami, who is a delight. I love Dami. And they're trying to figure out what's going on and how they can save their father's soul without destroying themselves in the process. So this was fun. I hadn't read anything by Novoa before. I think I had tried to read his previous YA sci-fi book, and I just didn't vibe with it. But this was fun. It very much hit the itch that I have of waiting for the new season of Our Flag Means Death. And I liked it. So one of the things I particularly liked was it talks about the colonial history of the Caribbean, and we have Latin pirates. We have people fighting colonial powers. I also thought the magic itself was pretty interesting and how that was approached. And Dami was a delight. I know Novoa has another book coming out that's following Dami, and I am so excited for that because they were just my favorite part of this book. I did like Mud, and how a good chunk of this book was them trying to find a place where they belonged after losing their home, and trying to stay true to themselves, but also find a way to rescue their dad. This did have a bit of protagonist ignores plot to do side quest component to it, which was fine, but Mara is particularly adamant about not making deals with devils until that's the only thing they can do. The romance for me didn't quite work. Like, this is interesting because Boss has that kind of insta attraction, very much like, oh, I'm super into you with Mar, but Mar isn't in, like, as, I think they're either kind of ignoring it or just being like choosing not to see it for a good chunk of it. So it was very interesting to get that other side of it where it's not the protagonist that's very into the love interest right away, but the love interest who's into the protagonist. But Boss otherwise was just kind of bland. I will say the other thing that did kind of bug me was just kind of the lack of ladies, which I get it, it's a pirate book, but I do wish, you know, like Boss, we never hear about his mom. With Mar, it's dead mom, which is fine, but that's just one of the things that does kind of bug me. But overall, it was a fun read. I gave it a 3.75. If you're looking for something that, like I said, scratches that Our Flag Meets Death wish with Latin pirates, if you really love Jim and want something similar, I would recommend. I will say there's also Magic Top Surgery, which is pretty great. I liked that. Then I read the new Cat Sebastian, We Could Be So Good. This is her new release, and it is set in the 1950s. Follows Nick Russo, who is an Italian-American from Brooklyn, who works on a newspaper, and Adam, who is the newspaper owner's son, and he gets assigned to the newsroom to learn more about the paper, become more familiar with what's going on. And Nick didn't initially want to like him, want to be friends with him, but he ends up rescuing Adam from a filing cabinet in the morgue, which is where they collect clips from newspapers, and they end up becoming friends. And Nick falls in love with Adam, but is like, no, like, he's straight, I'm gay, we're friends. Adam gets engaged to someone else who works at the newspaper, and then the engagement falls through and Adam moves in with Nick. And this was really great. So this is set in the 1950s, and Cat Sebastian did a lot of research into the queer history of New York City and what was going on there, and kind of highlighting the fact that even though people were closeted, even though if you went to gay bars or bathhouses, there was always a concern that there was undercover cop or that it might get raided. There were also people who were out in very, quiet, small ways. Several of Nick and Adam's coworkers are queer. One of the main points in this book is a real article written by the Village Voice about queer people. There's mention of different out queer people throughout history, and yeah, I really enjoyed this. I also really liked the relationship between Adam and Nick and kind of how they navigated the power dynamics, and also Adam's coming out and realizing that he's not just attracted to women, but he's also attracted to men, and also learning more about Nick and what it was like being Italian American at that time. And I just really enjoyed this. This was just a very nice, quiet romance novel that had some really great parts to it and was about community and finding love, and even the bleak moment worked for me because it wasn't necessarily a breakup, but they did have to spend some time apart. So yeah, I gave this a 4.25 out of 5. This really, really worked for me. So I realized I forgot to mention at the top that I actually did have a DNF this month, and it was Just As You Are by Camille Kellogg. This is a queer Pride and Prejudice retelling. And in this book, the Bennett sisters are not sisters. They're friends who all work at a queer magazine called Nether Fields that gets bought by two wealthy lesbians who are our Darcy and Bingley counterparts. And I made it about a quarter of the way in before I decided to DNF. And there were a few reasons. One was the writing just felt a little awkward. So at Nether Fields, there are rooms that are named after different queer icons, and the way that it's said is just super awkward. So like the Janelle room, named after Janelle Monáe, or the Kyoko room, named after Hayley Kiyoko, and it felt very like, why are you explaining queer icons? Like, that's something I feel like you could trust the reader with, and so that it kind of made me a little, And then the other reason that I ended up DNFing was I didn't like the dynamics of both Jane and Liz dating the bosses, so dating the owners. And I was thinking about why this didn't work for me, where I was more okay with it in We Could Be So Good. And I think part of the thing is that even before Adam and Nick got together, they were working together and they were friends, and they had that history, that trust between them. Whereas with this one, we don't get it. And I also I think that the author could have, kept the rich white queers or rich white lesbians are buying, queer icons, where they could have had them buy like a failing lesbian bar. And they could have had some of those same dynamics in terms of changing, talking about gentrifying, in a way where it wasn't them being Jane and Liz's boss. And the dynamic just made me really uncomfortable. And I decided the writing wasn't engaging enough for me to work past that in the way that I could with the Cat Sebastian book. So I could see some other people liking it. For me, it hit some specific things that I don't like in my romances. The last book that I read in June was the first volume of Delicious in Dungeon by Ryoko Kui. This is the first in a manga series that is inspired by D&D, where we follow a group of adventurers who, after one of their own party members is taken by a dragon, are trying to go in to rescue her, but they've lost their food, lost their money, and if they want a chance to save her, they have to go in right away. And so one of the characters, Laos, suggests, what if we eat the monsters that we kill? And Marcel, who is their magic user, is just like, oh no. But they meet a dwarf who like helps them. And let me see if I can find, like, there's this beautiful art of the food that they make. And yeah, I was very charmed by this. This was pretty fun. I will say it did take me a little bit to get in because it's been a long time since I've read manga. But overall, I really enjoyed this. Like, the art was great. I really liked how it felt D&D-esque without it being a complete carbon copy. And I liked the setup and how I was exploring kind of the ecology of the dungeon and like what they're finding. And I've heard from some folks that it definitely ramps up in later books. Like, the first few volumes are more kind of, dungeon crawly and a little more whimsical, and then it gets heavier as the series goes on. So yeah, I liked it. I definitely am planning on borrowing the second volume. I have it on hold from the library, and I gave this 4 stars. This was just a lot of fun. I really liked it. Like I said, it's been a while since I've read manga, so I think this is a good start. So yeah. So that was my June. Some disappointments, some hits. Overall, just a pretty varied month. Have you read any of these books? Have you tried to get it back into manga after not reading it for a while? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoy what you see, please like and subscribe. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll talk with you later. Bye.